Hi everyone. So the last piece of revision we're going to consider for our narrative writing is spacing. Thinking about when should you start new lines, kind of what should your text look like. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start by looking at authors and see how are they choosing. So as we look at these, I just want to look at each and say, what am I seeing? And then why do I think the author is doing it this way? And then we'll try to compile a list for ourselves. So what I did is I just opened up half a dozen books to a random page. I took a picture of it and I put it into our slideshow. And we're going to see what authors are actually doing in their writing. So on the left, I have the whole page, and on the right, I pulled out some parts of it that I want to look at a little more closely. So I wanted to include the whole page so you have a visual of what it looks like overall, but just some things that you'll notice about all of them. Sometimes there are longer paragraphs, but you'll see that along with that, there's other things happening. So it's not just 100% block paragraphs. If a book looks just like that, it's probably going to turn off the reader. When I open a book, if it looks like a bunch of big block paragraphs, I am less inclined to read it. But with each of these, I want to look at when a new line starts. So when there's white space on the page, why is that white page existing? So if we look at this part here, this is one of the obvious ones, dialogue. So there are different ways you can use dialogue. So in this first one on the right, I'm not mad, I said angrily, okay, I'm wrong. At the end of each person speaking, they start a new line. But the author doesn't continue to do this because we see some dialogue here, and then we also see some dialogue here with the paragraph following it. So you don't always have to follow dialogue with the new line. Sometimes it's a nice place to do it. Sometimes it's nice to mix it up. So dialogue is one way to consider, but it's not the only thing that you have to do after dialogue. All right, if we take a look at this one, we have dialogue again. You can see that there's a little bit more spacing here. There's not as many block paragraphs, so there's smaller paragraphs going on. And thinking about writing strategy, like keep writing strategies in mind as we're doing this because they also play a part. So like I have italics here. I have short sentences here. In Death Valley, I had heard. But then specifically, I want to look at this line that's on its own. So the author decides to put this line completely on its own. And here, not only is it on its own, there's intentional capitalization. Everything is on lowercase here, even the I, and everything is also in bold. There's also not a period at the end. So a lot of weird things that the author's doing here. Again, we're trying to think, why would the author do this? Try to get into some of the author's intentionality. It's probably because this is important. We want to bold it so that it feels important. So the author kind of puts all those strategies together so that we're experiencing that the way the author wanted us. So when we're looking at these visually, sometimes we need to read a little more to see what the author is doing. So this one, again, we see a lot of block text in there. Just thinking about other writing strategies, there's a bunch of dashes going on in here. So that's another thing to think about including in your writing. But I'm going to read out these two paragraphs, and I want you to think about why did the author decide to move it where they did. At this, I stood up, packed up the set, and walked off. I never said out loud that she didn't know how to play. Disappointed as I was, I knew not to go that far. But my storming off was, I suppose, statement enough for her. It was maybe a day later. I came into room 20 at the top of the house. So if we look at these two paragraphs, we stop here. This thing that's happening kind of ends, and then they transition. It was maybe a day later. So in this one, they're kind of jumping forward. They're starting a new paragraph because time kind of shifts. So that's one thing you can consider. You can start a new paragraph when you're going to move forward from a scene or that image is over. Or even if you're kind of staying within the same idea, you can still jump forward, and then you might want to start a new line there. This one I wanted to show because there's not just one sentence on its own on a line, there's a bunch of them. So this is another thing. If you're the author, you want to think, how does your page look overall? So this page looks a lot different than some of the previous ones. There's a lot of singular things. Some of them are dialogue, like we see the dialogue here, but that's actually followed up with some more things and then some more dialogue. But we have, they were shocked, but they just stared at me. I couldn't believe it. He sounded insulted. He acted like he was the one who'd been wrong. So this is because all these statements are kind of having this importance, right? Reading them all in one paragraph isn't what the author wanted. The author wanted to come out and isolate all of them. So that's another thing that you can consider as you're going through and doing yours. On this one, we have some sentences on their own line, but we also have just single words on their own line. And it actually follows up a sentence beforehand. I just want to read it so you can kind of hear the impact of that thing being on its own line. So I'm going to start from the beginning of this excerpt on the right. But my hands and feet were huge. My feet were a size 11 in third grade. With my big feet and pencil body, I looked like a capital L walking down the road. And my skull was enormous, epic. My head was so big that little Indian skulls orbited around it. Some of the kids called me Orbit. So you can hear like the epic sounds different. It's its own sentence, it's on its own line. Like that's really going to stand out to us. And when you look at it on the page, like all of this white space, like that's what stands out to us, right? Like this word epic, as soon as I turn to this page, I see that word, and then I kind of start reading everything else. In here, I wanted to show you another example of dialogue. So just looking at the pages before, think of the balance of dialogue versus description. This one probably has the most dialogue we've seen. From up here all the way to down here, it's just a bunch of back and forth dialogue. You don't see that often in text. A lot of times it's interspersed with other descriptions, but this is also an option of a way to go, and then they kind of give more stuff at the end. So just thinking about how dialogue is going to live in your writing, how much white space we want. Do we want those conversations to have a lot, or do we want descriptions coming in between it? And then again, the way that you space it can also go along with the writing strategy. So this one, they not only put this on its own line, they also change the margins on the page, which is something that you can do for yours, and they also put it in italics. So we have this whole phrase, Mr. and Mrs. August Rosenblatt request the pleasure of your immediate presence in stateroom 3, car 48, for cocktails followed by a late dinner. So this is an invitation, and I'm getting more of a sense of it being an invitation because of what the author did here with their spacing. And if you look a little higher up on the page, they also make another space there, and it's different than some of the other paragraphs, right? So they're not starting a new chapter, but they do leave an extra line in there. That's something else to consider. So all these things kind of lead to a bunch of different options we can do for spacing and things we should be thinking about. So I want to look at it in two ways. When should I start a new line? And then what are ways that it can look? So when I'm starting a new line, I want to decide how I want that new line to look. So I might start a new line after dialogue sometimes, but not always. There's plenty of examples in there where the person didn't start a new line after dialogue. I might want to isolate an important thought, a sentence, a single word. When time's changing, I might want to do it. If I'm starting a new idea, I might want to do it. But really anything that's standing out to you as an author, if you're like, I want this idea separate, I want to move on to something new, but you shouldn't end up with a bunch of block paragraphs that's going to turn your reader off. And it also doesn't help to direct them. Like they don't know when you're making transitions or what things are important or when they should be thinking about a new idea. And then on the right, what can it look like? There's obviously those blocks of paragraphs. I would say those are the ones that you want the least of. You can have one sentence isolated out in space. You can have multiple single sentences isolated out in space, just one word isolated. You might change the margins, include some italics or bold in that. You might do it for a whole paragraph. You might just do it for one line. There's a lot of different ways text can look. If you're running out of ideas, like just look, like open up a book, look at some things that authors doing. And like we started this project, like copy some strategies authors are doing. When you're taking it, making it your own, like that's still a lot of work, a lot of intentionality for you as an author. So I just wanted to show you a couple of submissions, just what they look like. We're seeing a lot of the block paragraphs. So that's our goal, to move away from that a little bit. So today's assignment, there's some that you're gonna have to show me, but also in the end product, you're gonna have to do it for your whole assignment, right? So for today's assignment, you're going to choose 6 different places to revise your writing for spacing. Sorry, this is a holdover from our last one. Ignore this second line here. I'm doing a terrible job of crossing it out. You're gonna choose 6 different places to revise your writing for spacing. You're going to put a number in parentheses to show where you made that decision and then explain why you chose it. So let me show you what that looks like in mine. So I chose here and here to consider spacing. This line, Aiden didn't need to remind Mr. Truly that his handwriting was illegible. He knew his excuse never got him anywhere. Then I go to the thought, 2 pages, more like 2 minutes. So I started a new line here because I wanted to move Aiden's thoughts from what he was thinking about, like the stuff that was in his mind beforehand, to what's coming next. So it's kind of like a before and after. That's why I wanted to do that spacing. And I just kind of did a normal paragraph break. Like if you look at my writing here, like there's a lot of white space, right? Like I'm making decisions about how I want to space things out. So this one is a little bit shorter than you'd see like a paragraph, but I do have some longer paragraphs. I'm also leaning on like what we're thinking about with sentence length. My longer sentences might be longer paragraphs. My shorter sentences might live in shorter paragraphs or vice versa. So my number 2, until the next class, of course, I put that one on its own line because it's already kind of a short sentence, so it has some impact, but it's not super short. So instead of having it in a paragraph like I did with the word freedom up here, I decided to put it out on its own line. I thought that that added some emphasis to it. So all right, let me see if I can do a better job crossing this out this time. So what you're going to actually do for today's assignment is to choose 6 different places to revise your writing for spacing. Put a number and then explain why you made that change. But you're going to do this for your whole paper, right? Like you're going to go through and think about how you're going to space out everything because it shouldn't have those block paragraphs. This is the stage where you might start getting rid of scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, and thinking about how do all these things flow together? How am I going to space them? And then how am I going to tie them together a little bit?